Iyo, iyo. Abeg, I no wan talk too much for this video. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending your locations. Leave anything wey you dey do, even if say you no get data, borrow data, make you hear wetin this bishop talk for this video. Assuming say all the men of God wey we get dey speak up like this our country for don dey good by now. Lis ten to wetin this his name na Bishop Kukas. In fact, I no wan talk too much. As you dey watch this video, make you dey share am. Iyo, watch this video.
Our people are hungry. They are still poverty-stricken. They are living in destitution. Yes. Our democracy has not delivered what it promised to them. Yes. Democracy has not made them safe. Yes. Democracy has not ended years of oppressive and suffocating corruption. Yes. And yes, our people are still caught in the cusp of violence. However, our situation today is evident that our people have nailed their hopes for progress and development on the mask of democracy with all its flaws and very hostile, strong headwinds. It is historic for us in Nigeria that Nigeria has conducted 7 successive back-to-back elections since 1999 till date. These elections have been seriously flawed, they have been bloody, they have been chaotic, they have been below par. Yet, unlike a few years ago, Nigeria, neither the losers nor frustrated citizens of Nigeria have called the military to stage a coup, as it was, and it has always been the history of our country. Our people have now realized that military rule has proved itself to be a cure worse than the disease, and that the military itself has also realized the institutional damage it suffered from years of being in power. Therefore, the challenge now is for Africans of this generation to ensure that in our hands, the seeds of democracy are nurtured. Because of Nigeria, despite our troubles, despite our uncertainties, it has often been said that Nigeria, the unity of Nigeria is like a Catholic marriage. May not be happy, but it doesn't break up. This discussion is timely and auspicious. However, your topic, How Democracies Die, should be replaced by a more hopeful title, How Democracies Can Survive. For indeed, who has ever seen the corpse of a dead democracy, or even once a carcass? Our concerns, of course, should be on how to learn lessons about the consequences of democracy dying and seeking how to avoid what is happening across Africa. Any good driver seeing another car in the ditch after an accident would do well not to pity the car that is in the ditch, but to obey the rules of the road. And there is a saying in Hausa, for those of you who speak Hausa, translated, it says, if you see your brother's beard on fire, put water on your own. Africans must learn that democracy is hard work with no easy answers, not because Africans are not searching well, but because those easy answers are not found anywhere. Revitalizing the civic space by free speech, a free media, and a civil society that is alive to its challenges is the best strategy of keeping authoritarianism at bay and keeping people hopeful. Ahead of Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999, I published a book titled Democracy and Civil Society in Nigeria. And my conclusion in that book, then as now, very simple, that democracy and autocracy cancel themselves out. One cannot exist if the other, both of them cannot coexist, because one's existence defeats the existence of the other. This is neither the time nor the place to debate or define democracy. However, it is important to note that each democratic seed has had its own story of growth, harvest, or failure, depending on where and when it was sown, who nurtured it, on which soil, under what weather, and to what end. By way of definition, the world has come to accept Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg speech definition in 1863, that democracy is a government of the people, for the people, and by the people, as literally cast in stone. However, on further interrogation, there are gaps in democracy's definition and its operational claims. Once we shift gears to identify geographical locations, cultures, and perceptions of who the people are, and who defines who the people are. And I cannot improve on what President Obasanjo just said, because I told him the quote of what he said should stand side by side with Abraham Lincoln's claim. And what is also very interesting is that Abraham Lincoln delivered this speech in 1863, and it's the same 1963, much later, 100 years later, that Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And you notice that even in that speech, which was delivered, if you are familiar with Washington, with the statue of Abraham Lincoln, so India, when Martin Luther King says 100 years ago, he was referring to the Gettysburg speech. But of course, he makes the point that 100 years later, all the promises that were made or conceptualized in that speech have never really been realized. And I think we can repeat the same thing, that there's always a distinction and a dissonance between the claims of politics and political rhetoric of when people are in campaign and the realities when governance takes off. So for me, fundamental to how democracy grows and is appreciated is the need to develop a political culture. But of course, we accept and we also know that systemic and consistent interruptions of this process by the military in Africa has created a sense of a culture of cynicism among our people. So if we are concerned about how democracies die, then like all dreams, we must accept the causes, that the causes are not the same. Because why X died is not the same with why B is alive. Therefore, when we speak of institutional fragility, shrinking spaces, the weakening and dismantling and weakening of democratic system, do we see them as causes or consequences of the death of democracy? In other words, are we perhaps confusing the symptom with the disease? Particular diseases do not kill everyone. Not everybody who is suffering from cancer necessarily dies. Some people live longer. Not everybody people die of malaria. People die of all kinds of things. How do we explain the fact that the same sickness strikes one person, kills the person, but then other people are able? The medical people will tell you it depends on your immune capacity. Therefore, during the period of COVID, for example, the records seem to suggest, not necessarily, but at least that's what the doctors were saying, that most people who died during COVID had other underlying ailments, which COVID simply exploited. And I think we can therefore say the same thing about democracy, that its capacity and ability to survive depends on what are the underlying socio-economic, cultural conditions around which democracy is supposed to grow. In the last 20 or so years, the world has witnessed reversals and decline in many countries in Europe and America. We have witnessed the rise of what is now called illiberal democracies, sustained by right-wing hate groups. We are witnessing the rise of terrorism around the world. Although all of these pose severe threats to democracy, I would rather that we speak of the challenge to democracy rather than its death. In my view, as long as humans exist, there will always be democracy. If we see democracy from the point of view of its leaders, presidents, institutions, parliaments, senators, senate presidents, political associations, political parties, then we can contemplate its death, because all of these institutions are subject to human mortality. However, when we see democracy as part of the human instinct, thirst, hunger, and quest for love, for fairness, for integrity, for a sense of belonging, for community and family, then as long as these ideals exist and they sustain and define humanity, democracy cannot die. The democratic instinct and ethos is already embedded in our DNA. To be sure, politicians and political parties, parliaments, constitutions can be banned or destroyed, as we have seen with autocrats in uniform or out of uniform. But the human instincts that are supposed to nurture cannot die. We can therefore argue that certain types of structures for the pursuit of human happiness, security, and well-being could collapse in the hands of wicked men and women, but others will spring up. Democracies might die in form, just as food, arts, social habits differ among our peoples and countries, but the essence still remains the same. Now, you heard about Nigerians' jollof rice. Ghanaians are free to produce a poor copy, but still jollof rice. But when you know yourself that when you eat jollof rice in Ghana, when you eat jollof rice in Kenya, you know that they are just practicing. The problem of many African countries, but you might say jollof rice is jollof rice, but there are differentiations. The problem with many African countries is that they never really experience successful transitions. After colonial rule, and I think, again, my friend, Professor Ihonvere, has written extensively about this, that is the assumption that we have that we transited to democracy. No, transition from dictatorship is not logically transition to democracy. In part because, as we saw with successful transition, especially by the military, they still managed to embed within the system of transitions landmines that later on exploded to send us back to the bottom of the hill.